Mateo Cruz was just a Manila street vendor, until Sheikh Hamdan al-Qasimi left him $100 million, and a hidden condition in the will exposed a secret that would unravel a decades-old royal scandal. Sheikh Hamdan al-Qasimi had built his life on discipline, secrecy, and control. His name carried weight across Dubai's business world, where he was known for making calculated decisions that rarely failed. His wealth came from decades of investments in construction, shipping, and international trade, forming an empire that operated quietly but efficiently. Unlike many men of his status, he avoided the spotlight. Public appearances were rare, interviews almost non-existent, and his personal life remained completely shielded from attention. Those closest to him respected his silence but never questioned it. Everything about Sheikh Hamdan suggested stability. His routines were predictable, his business dealings structured, and his relationships carefully managed. Even his inner circle, composed of legal advisors and longtime associates, knew very little about his past beyond what was necessary. There were no scandals attached to his name, no controversies that could damage his reputation. He was seen as a man who had nothing to hide. That perception changed the moment news of his death spread. The announcement was sudden and brief. Official statements described it as a natural passing, offering no additional details. The lack of information immediately created speculation among business circles and extended family members. Despite the curiosity, arrangements moved quickly. A private funeral was organized, attended only by close relatives and trusted associates. The ceremony was controlled and quiet, reflecting the same secrecy that had defined his life. Days later, attention shifted to his will. Legal representatives confirmed that Sheikh Hamdan had left behind detailed instructions regarding the distribution of his wealth. The reading of the will was scheduled to take place in a secured office in Dubai, with only selected individuals permitted to attend. Family members arrived expecting a traditional allocation of assets, properties, investments, and financial holdings divided among relatives and business partners. The atmosphere inside the room was tense but predictable. As the document was opened, the initial sections followed expectations. Properties were assigned, business shares were redistributed, and charitable donations were outlined with precision. Each clause reflected careful planning, reinforcing the image of a man who had controlled every aspect of his life, even in death. Then, the final section was revealed. A sum of $100 million had been allocated to a man named Mateo Cruz. The name meant nothing to anyone in the room. There was immediate confusion. Family members exchanged uncertain glances, while legal advisors paused to confirm the accuracy of the document. The will was verified as authentic, signed and witnessed according to strict legal standards. There was no error. The mystery deepened as additional details were read. Mateo Cruz was identified as a street vendor living in Manila, a man with no known connection to Sheikh Hamdan. There were no business records linking them, no family ties, and no public history that could explain the decision. The inclusion of his name in such a significant portion of the estate raised serious questions. But the most unusual part was still to come. The inheritance was not immediate. It was conditional. A sealed document, referenced within the will, outlined a requirement that Mateo had to fulfill before the money could be released. The nature of this condition was not disclosed in the main document, adding another layer of mystery to an already confusing situation. What should have been a straightforward legal process turned into something far more complicated. A man who had lived in complete privacy had left behind a decision that challenged everything people thought they knew about him. And somewhere in Manila, a street vendor who had never heard of Sheikh Hamdan was about to become the center of a story that would expose secrets buried for decades. Once the shock of the will's revelation settled, legal representatives in Dubai began coordinating with authorities in Manila to verify the identity of the man named in the document. The process had to be exact, because a sum as large as $100 million could not be released without thorough verification. The first step was confirming that Mateo Cruz was a real person and not an alias or mistaken identity. Investigators located him within days. Mateo was living in a densely populated neighborhood on the outskirts of Manila, where he operated a small food stall along a busy street. His daily routine was simple. Early mornings at the market, long afternoons serving customers, and quiet evenings in a modest rented room nearby. He had no known criminal history, no unexplained wealth, and no record that connected him to international business or high-profile individuals. When legal officials informed him that he had been named in a foreign will, Matteo reacted with confusion. He had never heard of Sheikh Hamdan al-Qasimi. The idea that a man of such status would leave him an enormous inheritance seemed impossible. But the documents were legitimate, signed and notarized according to strict legal procedures in Dubai. There was no mistake. To confirm his identity, authorities conducted a detailed review. Fingerprints were taken, official documents were examined, and local records were compared. Everything matched. Matteo was exactly who he claimed to be, a man raised in the Philippines with no known connection to Dubai or the Middle East. With his identity confirmed, legal teams moved to the next step. The sealed condition in the will was opened. Inside was a single, unexpected requirement. Matteo must submit to a DNA test. Only if the test confirmed a specific biological connection would the inheritance be granted. This clause changed the nature of the case completely. It suggested that Sheikh Hamdan believed there was more to Matteo's identity than anyone knew. The request stunned everyone involved. There had been no public claims of family ties, no rumors, and no documentation linking the two men. Yet the condition was explicit and legally binding. Without the DNA confirmation, the inheritance could not be processed. Matteo agreed to the test, though the decision weighed heavily on him. The request raised unsettling questions about his own past. His early life had always felt incomplete. He had grown up with limited information about his family, raised by relatives who avoided detailed discussions about his origins. Official documents offered little clarity, and some records appeared incomplete. As samples were collected and sent for analysis, investigators began examining Sheikh Hamdan's past with renewed interest. Travel records revealed that he had visited the Philippines multiple times over a span of years. These visits were not tied to public business dealings and had never been widely reported. Financial records revealed additional anomalies. Periodic payments had been sent from accounts linked to the sheikh to recipients in Manila. The amounts were modest compared to his wealth, but their timing and duration suggested ongoing support rather than isolated transactions. These transfers had stopped abruptly years earlier without explanation. As investigators pieced together these details, a possibility began to emerge that had never been considered before. Sheikh Hamdan's connection to Matteo might not have been random. The DNA results, once released, had the potential to reshape everything people believed about the sheikh's past, his private life, and the reason behind the extraordinary inheritance. The DNA results arrived under strict confidentiality, handled only by authorized legal and forensic teams. The analysis was conducted twice to eliminate any possibility of error. When the final report was reviewed, the conclusion was clear and undeniable. Matteo Cruz was the biological son of Sheikh Hamdan al-Qasimi. The confirmation sent immediate shock through everyone involved in the case. What had begun as a mysterious inheritance now became a deeply personal revelation. Sheikh Hamdan, a man known for his privacy and discipline, had lived a hidden life that no one in his inner circle had ever suspected. Investigators quickly returned to the sheikh's past, now viewing every detail through a new lens. Travel records that once seemed insignificant became critical. Over the course of nearly a decade, Sheikh Hamdan had made several trips to Manila, often staying for extended periods in areas far removed from business districts or luxury accommodations. These visits had never been explained in official documents. During one of those visits, records showed that he had spent time in a quiet residential neighborhood. Local archives revealed the presence of a young woman living there at the time, someone who had little public documentation but appeared briefly in rental agreements and community records before disappearing entirely from official systems. The timeline aligned precisely with Matteo's birth. Further investigation uncovered more details. Financial transfers from Sheikh Hamdan's accounts had been directed toward individuals connected to that same neighborhood. The payments were consistent, continuing for several years before stopping suddenly. The pattern suggested ongoing support, possibly for the woman and her child. It became increasingly clear that Sheikh Hamdan had maintained a hidden relationship, one that resulted in the birth of Matteo. For reasons that remained unclear, he had chosen to keep this part of his life completely secret. There were no records within his official documents acknowledging a child, and none of his family members had ever been informed. But the discovery raised even more questions. Why had the support stopped? Why had the connection been severed? And most importantly, why had Sheikh Hamdan chosen to reveal the truth only after his death? As investigators examined the remaining contents of the will, they realized that the DNA confirmation was only the first step. The inheritance was not automatically granted upon proving the biological connection. There was another condition, one that had not yet been fully understood. The will required Matteo to uncover something hidden within Sheikh Hamdan's past. This detail shifted the focus of the case once again. The inheritance was no longer just about acknowledging a secret child. It was tied to an unresolved event, something significant enough that Sheikh Hamdan had built an entire legal condition around it. Authorities began searching for any incidents during the Sheikh's visits to Manila that might match this requirement. Old police records, archived reports, and local testimonies were reviewed carefully. Among these documents, one case began to stand out. A missing person report filed years earlier. During the same period Sheikh Hamdan had been present in the city. The report described a young woman who had disappeared without explanation. Her last known location was the same neighborhood connected to Sheikh Hamdan's visits. As investigators compared timelines, financial records, and personal connections, a disturbing possibility began to take shape. The hidden chapter of Sheikh Hamdan's life was not just about secrecy. It was connected to an event that had never been resolved. Matteo's discovery of his true identity was only the beginning. The inheritance he had been promised was now tied to uncovering a truth that someone, at some point, had tried to erase. Once the missing person case was linked to Sheikh Hamdan's past, the investigation shifted into a deeper and more complex phase. Authorities in Manila reopened archived records that had been untouched for years. The case file was thin, containing only basic details, a short description of the missing woman, and a timeline that ended abruptly without resolution. There were no suspects, no confirmed sightings, and no clear explanation for her disappearance. At first, it appeared to be just another unsolved case. But as investigators began cross-referencing the timeline with Sheikh Hamdan's travel history, the connection became impossible to ignore. The woman had vanished during the exact period when the Sheikh had been staying in the same neighborhood. Financial records showed that payments linked to her stopped immediately after her disappearance. The pattern suggested that something significant had happened, something that had forced a sudden end to all contact. Matteo was given access to a collection of private documents left behind by Sheikh Hamdan. These materials had been sealed separately from the main will, only to be opened once the DNA connection was confirmed. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, and financial records that had never been shared with anyone. The photographs showed a younger version of Sheikh Hamdan in Manila, far removed from his usual environment. He appeared relaxed, blending into the surroundings without the formality that defined his public life. In several images, he was seen with the same woman who had been reported missing. The pictures suggested a close relationship, one that went beyond a brief encounter. The handwritten notes added another layer of detail. They contained fragmented thoughts, dates, and references to meetings that seemed important but were not fully explained. Some entries hinted at concern, even fear, as if Sheikh Hamdan had become aware of something he could not control. As Matteo examined the material, the connection to his own life became clearer. The woman in the photographs matched the limited descriptions he had heard about his mother. The timeline, the location, and the financial support all aligned with his early childhood. This meant the missing person case was not just a distant mystery. It was personal. Investigators then uncovered additional evidence hidden within financial records. Payments had been made not only to the woman but also to individuals connected to local authorities and intermediaries. These transactions appeared irregular, lacking clear explanations. The timing of the payments suggested they were not routine support but something else, possibly attempts to manage a situation quietly. Further analysis revealed that certain official records related to the disappearance had been altered. Witness statements were incomplete, and some documents were missing entirely. The inconsistencies pointed toward interference, suggesting that someone had deliberately influenced the investigation. The deeper the case was examined, the more it began to resemble a cover-up. Sheikh Hamdan's role, however, remained unclear. The documents he left behind did not directly explain what had happened, but they indicated that he had been aware of the situation. His notes reflected a sense of urgency, as if he had been trying to preserve information that might otherwise be lost. The condition in the will now made sense. Matteo was not just being asked to prove his identity. He was being guided toward uncovering a truth that had been hidden for years. The inheritance was tied to exposing whatever had been buried within that missing person case. As investigators prepared to move forward, it became evident that the answers would not only reveal what happened to the woman, but also expose a network of actions and decisions that had remained concealed for decades. The final stage of the investigation brought everything together in a way no one had expected. With the documents left behind by Sheikh Hamdan and the reopened case files in Manila, authorities began reconstructing the events that led to the disappearance of the woman who was now believed to be Matteo's mother. Each piece of evidence, once scattered and incomplete, started forming a clear and disturbing picture. The timeline revealed that she had been living a quiet life until she became connected to Sheikh Hamdan during one of his visits. Their relationship, though hidden, appeared genuine, supported by photographs and consistent financial assistance. For a time, everything suggested stability, but that stability did not last. Further analysis of the records uncovered that the woman had become aware of certain activities taking place around her. Activities that involved individuals with influence both locally and internationally. Financial documents pointed toward irregular transactions linked to business operations that extended beyond legal boundaries. These operations appeared to involve smuggling routes and unregulated trade, quietly supported by figures who had the power to avoid scrutiny. The woman's connection to Sheikh Hamdan placed her dangerously close to this network. Evidence suggested that she had discovered information that could expose these operations. Her movements in the days before her disappearance showed unusual activity, including visits to locations connected to individuals later identified in the financial records. Shortly after, she vanished without a trace. What had once been treated as an isolated missing person case now appeared to be something far more deliberate. Investigators uncovered proof that local officials had received payments shortly after the disappearance. These transactions aligned with changes in the case file, missing statements, altered reports, and the sudden halt of the investigation. The pattern indicated that the truth had been intentionally buried. Sheikh Hamdan's role in these events became clearer through his own records. While there was no evidence that he had been directly involved in the disappearance, his notes revealed that he had discovered what had happened after the fact. The tone of his writings suggested regret and urgency. He had attempted to trace the network responsible but had been unable to act openly without exposing his own hidden life and the existence of his son. Instead, he chose a different path. He preserved everything. The will was his final plan, a way to ensure that the truth would eventually surface, even if it meant revealing secrets he had kept for decades. By tying the inheritance to the investigation, he created a situation where Matteo would be compelled to uncover the past and bring it into the open. As the full story emerged, authorities in multiple jurisdictions began taking action. Individuals connected to the financial records and altered case files were identified and investigated. The network that had operated quietly for years started to unravel as evidence linked past events to ongoing operations. For Matteo, the outcome was life-changing in ways that went far beyond money. He had started as a street vendor with no knowledge of his origins, only to discover that he was the son of a powerful sheikh and the key to exposing a hidden scandal. The truth about his mother, though painful, provided answers that had been missing his entire life. In the end, the inheritance was released, but it carried a weight far greater than its value. It was not just a transfer of wealth. It was the conclusion of a story built on secrecy, loss, and a final attempt to correct the past. The will had done exactly what it was designed to do: force the truth into the open, no matter how deeply it had been buried.